Afternoon, everyone. My name is Amato Uno. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the director of the Million Voters Project. MVP is a coalition of California's strongest power building networks rooted in communities of color across the state, including API Force, ACE, California Calls, CHIRLA, the Orange County Civic Engagement Table, PICO California, and Power California. MVP local partners represent over 90 local organizations in 26 counties across the state. The heart and soul of MVP is our ground game. MVP has built the statewide field and integrated voter engagement infrastructure necessary to shift the electorate to be more reflective of California's demographics to advance structural reform. And just last year, MVP ran the field for the Prop 15 campaign and consistently deploys one of the largest field programs in the state. Ground game is critical and will remain the heart and soul of MVP. And one of our emerging strategies is the importance of integrating community-based narrative and strategic communications with our ground game to help shape worldview, advance a narrative of interdependence, a government that cares for us, and corporate accountability. This is why we're here today, to increase alignment on the value of community-based narrative and strategic communications, to share lessons about how MVP integrates our ground game with our narrative strategy, and to diversify our toolkit. And we invite lessons and strategic inquiry from all of you. So right now, please take a moment to place your name, organization, and pronoun in the chat again. We encourage use of the chat function to engage as speakers and really grapple with the content. I'm incredibly excited about the folks that we have presenting today. Humbly speaking, I think they're some of the most gifted narrative strategists in the state, and we have the privilege of learning from them today. So right now, I'm going to bring up the slide. We're trying to get a sense about who's in the room. So Jonathan, I'm gonna turn it over to you right now, if that's okay.
Sounds good, appreciate it, Amato. Hey folks, Jonathan Tran with the California Endowment. As you're seeing on the screen right now, if folks don't mind taking out your cell phone, we're gonna try to use multiple devices going at it. So if you can do a screenshot or open your camera app, scan the QR code. If you want to open a browser, you can also go to menti.com and then enter the code. I'm actually going to take over the screen share really quickly so that folks can see the results, but the code will still be up there. So if folks don't mind just doing this really quick.
So you're getting a sense of who is on this call. We have a mix of national funders, statewide funders, regional, local funders, and of course, some of the organizers on the call. Jonathan, you want to get to the next question?
Yeah, let's do that. Oops.
So this next question is, in addition to finding out who's in the room, we also want to try to get a sense about your institution's familiarity and expertise with narrative power. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you assess your institution's familiarity with narrative power? Awesome. Jonathan, how many responses do we have here?
We're getting towards 30.
Right. So a good mix, right, of national funders, statewide funders, local regional funders, and some level of familiarity and expertise with narrative power. So we'll give you a chance to, again, we want to encourage folks to use the chat function to grapple with the content, raise any questions. And right now, I'm actually going to turn it over to Sandra Witt with the California Endowment, who is going to lead off the next section of this presentation. Sandra, please.
Thanks, Amato. I just want to say it's really great to be here with all of you today for this exciting and thought-provoking session. I think we'll see it's a thought-provoking session on community-driven narrative power. I'm Sandra Witt, Program Director of Statewide Power Infrastructure at the California Endowment, and I just want to say a few words about TCE's journey on narrative change and how we got here. So over the course of the last 10 years that I've been at the endowments with Building Healthy Communities, TCE's approach to narrative change has evolved from primarily a foundation-driven approach to one that now seeks to support a collective narrative approach that centers community organizing and builds power to achieve health and racial justice. So on the one hand, we have seen tremendous saturation with TCE-driven campaigns like Health for All, Schools Not Prisons. And while many issue campaigns have been effective, they have not always tackled the underlying or deeper narratives that we all hold that help us make sense of the world. And so the evolution of this work for us really recognizes that in order to secure the systemic and big structural and cultural changes that we seek, an equitable, just California where everyone belongs, these amplified narratives must originate from the community, and that sustainable, long-lasting narrative change depends on a robust infrastructure to support it. So rather than looking at narrative change as a series of campaigns, we are learning that transformative change requires a robust narrative ecosystem, one that centers the voices of those most impacted by injustice, is not reliant on traditional narrative gatekeepers, and is deeply connected to organizing and power building. So we have just thrilled to be able to have supported MVP in their bold attempt to work with a wide range of members spanning geographies, issues, bases, and different approaches to align around a narrative strategy. And as I am sure all of us who have tried to get philanthropy aligned around a common goal and approach know this is not easy work. That they've not only been able to identify dominant narratives that must shift for us to win, but have also been able to test and refine their strategy from the ground up is really exciting. So today's conversation reflects an important evolution of our approach, one that has required us and requires philanthropy to embrace trust-based grant making and rethink who we are putting in the driver's seat in this work. So we are grateful and excited to partner and continue to learn alongside MVP and others about what it takes and how best to support this work going forward. We also are looking forward to partnering with all of you on this shared endeavor to build narrative power from the ground up. So I'm going to do one quick little poll before passing it along. Jonathan, do I toss that back to you for the poll?
Yep, I'll take over the screen again. Give me a sec.
Okay, cool.
So folks, go back to your Mentimeter, your phones.
Okay. My institution funds integrated voter engagement and power building. How are we doing here?
All right, moving to the next question.
Cool. So quite a lot of folks on this call fund power building and IBE. That's awesome. My institution funds narrative power. Quite a few folks funding narrative power.
To the next question.
Awesome. My institution has engaged grantee partners about narrative power.
And then the last one is open-ended. So folks, please enter your responses.
What about community-based narrative power excites you the most? There are a lot of folks here who have been funding this work, so I'm excited to hear the responses. Winning, reshaping worldview, understanding what is most important to our communities, creating equitable systems, shared strategy and vision value setting, lifting up stories from communities themselves, winning hearts and minds and building governance power and systems change. These are awesome. Raising voices of folks impacted by systems, offering their vision, embedding power in community. Wow, there are a lot here. This is great. This is great. Well, I don't know about you, but I am super inspired by these comments. And I think we are going to be so inspired and learn so much from the rest of the presentation. So clearly there's a lot of expertise in the room. And no matter what you answered, you are in the right place for this conversation. There's many different ways to get engaged and to support narrative change work. Part of why you are in the right place is really because of our next speaker, Jung Hee, who I get to introduce, Deputy Director of Power California. Jung Hee is a social justice communications and narrative change warrior with many years of experience. I love how she taught, how it mentioned in her bio that she's a plotter, a schemer, a dreamer for social justice. Love that. She is going to help us break down some of the things that we need to think about as we're thinking about narrative change, narrative power, and how it connects to transformative change. I'll just say that in her current role as Deputy Director, she oversees strategies and campaigns to build the power of young people, shift narrative, and advance policies that will transform California to a more just and equitable state for all. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jung Hee.
Thanks, Sandra, for that introduction. Also, just thank you for just sharing TCE's journey and how you all as an organization have evolved and are learning and growing your understanding of narrative and narrative power. Great to be here with everybody. I'm super excited for this conversation. For anyone who knows, I really like to nerd out around narrative and talking about narratives, so I'm excited to be here. I think the first thing we want to start before, part of what I need to do is just talk a little bit about MVP's evolution and our lessons around narrative and narrative power and narrative change and the way we're thinking about it. And then also, before we get into that, I think we want to maybe try to lay out some key definitions or what we call working definitions from the way we're thinking about it, right? So we recognize that narrative change is an evolving field, right? And people may have different understandings. And so for the purposes of establishing some common language understanding for at least this conversation, I want to share just a few working definitions that really reflect our approach to community-driven narrative change. So I'm wondering great, thank you. The tech people are completely on it, thank you. So the first one is really around narrative, right? We think about narratives as collection of interrelated stories that use values and ideologies to represent a central idea. So we use narratives to explain how society should work. And in that way, narratives are never neutral. They always carry values and ideology. And the purposes of narrative is to really establish norms and compel consensus or action and to make meaning. And so just to bring this home a bit and just make it more concrete, I wanted to just take a minute to personalize the power of narrative in my own life, right? I'm actually a product of one of the most powerful narratives in the world, and that's the narrative America, that anything is possible for anyone in this country, and that no matter where you come from, you can quote unquote make it here if you're willing to work for it. This narrative is so powerful, it compelled my parents from the poor countryside of Korea, one parent who actually didn't graduate from high school, another who didn't finish the 3rd grade, to uproot their entire lives and their 3 children and risk everything and the very little they had to actually move across the ocean, plant themselves in a foreign country, in the middle of the country where they didn't speak the language, work at a furniture factory and a garment factory, years later open their own small business, and to subject themselves to countless acts of racism and white supremacy that told them that they didn't belong here, right? Including being physically assaulted by white coworkers who accused my father of stealing American jobs. And despite all of that, this idea and narrative America still holds tremendous power over my parents. And that is true for millions and millions of people, right? Across the country and around the globe. And this narrative America compels people like my parents every day, right? And the point is that of the story is that narratives aren't just about the words we choose or how we frame the facts or what we put on social media. We have to remember and constantly remind ourselves that narratives have enduring power to shape people's understanding of what's possible and to determine human behavior and the choices that people make, including the solutions and policies that people, will support. And that's why we need to have and fight for narrative power, because ultimately we want to redefine what's possible in everyday people's lives. Next slide. So narrative change, then, the way we think about narrative change is that there are strategies for how we change dominant narratives, right? And just here, right, the purpose of narrative change strategies are really to make our ideas common sense and mainstream. And dominant narratives are dominant for a reason. They actually reflect and are held by power structures. And it's why narrative change is so hard, is because they're actually backed by real power, right? And we need more than just the right words or good ideas. We actually need the power to make our narratives dominant. So going on to the next, which brings us to narrative power, right? Narrative power is actually our ability to make our solutions common sense and shape what's possible by leveraging those who actually set the rules, set the norms, and make decisions. And in that way, narrative power can't be disconnected from other forms of social and political power that's needed to actually create systemic change. This is why the integration of power building and seeing narrative as part of power building is so essential, because it's not just about building the power to get our message out, right? But we actually need the institutional governing and all the forms of power to make our narratives dominant. And, just to sort of bring it back to the example of the dominant narrative of America, it's been built on centuries of US and foreign domestic policies and institutions and empire building. And it's reinforced through television, movies, pop culture, news media, and so many other cultural endeavors that are beamed around the world. And that dominant narrative is backed by military, financial, and political power, and it's intended to uphold America's dominance in the world. And we need those kinds of institutional power to make our narratives as dominant, right? And then the last is just really around strategic communication, which often people talk about when we talk about narrative and narrative change. We just think about strategic communications as a set of tools and strategies that we use to advance our narratives and to consistently say the right things to the right people at the right time to achieve our actual, short and long-term goals. And, just to say that strategic communication is just one set of tools and strategies, there are others and many others, right? Cultural strategies, policy change, all the different ways that we can actually set of tools and strategies that we can use to advance narrative. So hopefully this helps establish for us some common ground, right? And these, and just, just to be like, these working definitions that we use are informed by work that I've done myself with also the Reframe team, as well as folks like Rashad Robinson from the Color of Change and Narrative Initiative. And I'm happy to share resources or articles that might be helpful to people post-meeting or post-conversation. So now that we've established some common language and just sharing our thinking and how we think about narrative and narrative change and narrative power, what I want to do is just take a few minutes to share a bit about why narrative matters to an electoral power building coalition like ours. As Amato said, we are the bread and butter, the center of MVP has been our massive ground game. We're known for our massive field apparatus and capacity. We've already moved 1.5 million voters to the polls on our issues just since 2018. But we also have learned over the years, right, that no matter the policy fight or issue we've taken on in the last 10 years, we keep facing the same underlying narratives and ideological barriers, right? Mistrusting government, cynicism that nothing is going to change, right? Rugged individualism, and racial divisions about who's deserving and undeserving. And we've come to realize in order to advance major structural change, it's going to require us to change dominant narratives about the role of government, the free market, and to be able to create new narratives about interdependence and government that cares for us and corporate accountability. So MVP has adopted this unified strategy to shift power and ideology through a really integrated approach that includes our large scale IBE organizing ground game, right? Community-driven narrative change and infrastructure building, right? Which is really about building the spaces, the processes, the vehicles, and human capacity, right? To be able to align on narrative and organizing strategies. So one of the most recent campaigns that MVP has led was around the schools and communities first that Amato mentioned earlier. And it really provided us some really good lessons for why the narrative change is such a central part of our strategy, right? So as folks, most folks should, I assume, recall, it's like, it wasn't that long ago, but a lot has happened since 2020, so understandably. But schools and communities first was, would fundamentally have changed our commercial property tax structure and would have stopped the systemic defunding of our schools and communities that's been happening for the last 40 years. By ensuring that wealthy corporations actually paid their fair share in property taxes. But one of the major strategies that we used, along with our unprecedented ground game to move over 600,000 voters to the polls, was also a $5 million public education and narrative campaign. That was mostly on digital, and Victor is going to actually talk a bit more about that. But it really focused on combating cynicism among our voters and building issue support. And through that campaign, we successfully engaged several million Californians dozens of times through our digital strategies and online. And this is in addition to the central campaign's $50 million that it spent on the air game, mostly to reach voters through TV, radio, digital ads, mailers, and social and earned media. And unfortunately, our measure lost by a really narrow margin, really a mere 2 percentage points, right? And it seems like losing doesn't seem like something that's reflecting progress or to be celebrated, but if we have to remember where we started, like most people told us that we wouldn't come close, that this was a third rail of politics, right? And that, this was political suicide. But we came closer than most people thought possible. And in fact, excruciating close to breaking this third rail. And even though we didn't win, we believe it's our investment in the narrative and strategic communications, along with our tremendous ground game, that is one of the main reasons why we got so close, right? We believe that we helped shift the narrative and debate on this issue. When Prop 13, the measure that established the loophole, first passed, it was in the late 70s, it passed with 62% of the vote. And that level of support has really eroded, right? And has disappeared. And our post-election results really showed that our narrative did break through, that the millions who voted for the measure and cited investing in our schools, closing corporate loopholes, and tax fairness as the top reasons for voting yes. But for those who opposed the measure, the top reasons they cited were doubts about, one, how the money would be spent, i.e. mistrust in government, right? And the impact of on their own home property taxes, which were about deliberate lies and confusion given by the opposition. And so in the end, one of the key things we're drawing out of this is that what we found was that we didn't have enough power yet or the resources for our narratives to win, right? The opposition raised $124 million and outspent us 2-1 in those last 2 weeks. But despite the losses, what we're drawing from that experience, as well as from our previous campaigns, is about why investing in narrative change and narrative power really matters, right? So one for us is that structural change and reform reorganizes power relationship, right? In our society, in our economy. And those with power are not going to give that up easily. And our side has to match the power and wealth of the opposition if we want to win. And we are at this point nowhere near as well resourced enough, right? Especially in the comms and narrative side, as our opposition is, to be able to actually get our narratives to dominance, right? Given the uneven playing field that we're already starting in. I think the second key lesson that we're really drawing from this is that traditional communications approaches are not enough, right? We actually have to change the way we communicate. It's not enough to explain policy details and why they're good. We actually have to fight for big ideas and play the long game to shift dominant narratives, to combat cynicism and mistrust in government and racial division. Structural change is about the big ideas, right? It's about doing things differently from how things have been done. And so it's about redefining what's possible. And our narratives have to be able to do the same thing. Third is that for us to win systemic change, we need the capacity and infrastructure to make our narratives and solutions common sense. As common sense as the right has made masses of people believe that government is ineffective. And for us, some of those key pieces of the infrastructure that we believe are critical and that we've been working to build is one is actually the strategic communications and narrative leadership and capacity of those in our community, right, that are most impacted, right? So, you know, to actually be able to drive community-driven narratives change strategies. And so, you know, at another point, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the lessons that Power California has from a 15-month narrative fellowship that we did last year that was supported by the California Endowment that was really about training, you know, young communicators and narrative strategists from our communities and our partner organizations. But I think it's one example and a model for the kind of capacity and investment that we need to make in developing leadership. The others is really about the vehicles, statewide vehicles that we create to make sure that we can actually align our narrative and messaging strategies, as well as the infrastructure that's needed to actually be able to, for rapid response, to be able to use crisis as opportunities to move narratives quickly, because that's where we find that most people are trying to make meaning of things. And it's a key opportunity for us to actually move narratives. And the last thing is, you know, we recognize that, I think the other key lessons for us here is that we recognize that the most powerful and successful narrative shifts come from the ground up. When it's, as you know, Sandra was saying earlier, when it's part of large scale organizing strategies to shift power. That has always been true, right? From the present Black Lives Matter movement to freedom struggles of the 60s, from the AIDS crisis to marriage equality fight, just to name a few examples, right? And so here at MVP, narrative change isn't about coming up with the great hashtag, making it go viral, or hiring a big firm to do publicity and create beautiful content, which there's nothing wrong with doing any of those things. But we see those things as products or tools that should result from and be a part of a larger organizing strategy to shift power, right? Because narrative change, like any other form of systemic change, comes from when we organize masses of people, especially those that are directly impacted, to shift power and ideology. And it's why it's so vitally important that we actually invest in developing the capacity of leadership and the leadership of narrative strategists from on the ground from our communities. We would never outsource organizing strategy, right? And we should not outsource narrative strategy. It has to be grounded and integrated into our organizing strategies. So in a nutshell, I think I'm at time, narrative matters to us because we recognize that narrative change that is led by communities most impacted, integrated into large scale organizing and electoral power building strategy, and that builds infrastructure within our movement ecosystem is what gives us the best chance to advance systemic change, right? I think that's my time. I'm gonna wrap it up there. I've said a lot. And I can't monitor, chat, and talk at the same time. So hopefully there's it's stimulating a lot of good conversation. But I think what we want to turn it to, right, Amato, is to open it up. We have a few key discussion questions that we wanted to bring you all into and just hear your thoughts and your reflections. And so I don't know we want to place them in a chat. Maybe I can read them out, Amato, and someone can place them in the chat.
Go ahead and verbalize it and I'll put it in the chat, Junkie. And we have about 5 to 7 minutes for this section.
Thank you. So the two questions we had is what resonates about community-based narrative change for you, and what community-based narratives are strategic to advance that you see? So I'm going to invite folks to chat, as well as I think we are opening up, right, the conversation, Amato. So you can take yourself off mute. Don't be shy. I'm going to call on some of my friends here if people don't start talking.
Get him, Junkie.
Any folks that want to chime in about what resonates for you all in terms of community-driven narrative change?
I'll jump in. This is Crispine from NCG. And you know, what resonates to me about this is just really understanding even the last elections and just how much misinformation was out there, and like having to pivot traditional strategies to not only engage voters, but also to debunk some of this misinformation.
Absolutely. And in this age of like hyper disinformation, it's so vital, right? It becomes even more urgent. Thank you, Crispin.
Hey, Jung Hee, long time no see. Hope
I
you're
was
doing
going to
well.
call you Joseph.
There it is. There it is. Hey, so one of the things that I actually really like is, and I think to your point around values and ideology, for people to see people who look like them, and you know, obviously there's the racial ethnic element, there's a real significant class element to it as well. And you know, those folks, you know, the folks from our communities are the best messengers for these, you know, these solutions. I think for distilling really complex ideas in a way that target the population that we care about. And so I just think that, you know, having our folks stand out and be the voices and the representatives and driving the messages is a really strong signal to the rest of the population that we're interested in targeting. I mean, in this instance, we're thinking about shifting the electorate. So we think about the people who, you know, they may be moving towards the likely voters, but have been, you know, newer or less likely voters, you know, and so getting more folks that seem to connect with that population, I think is just, I just think it's smart strategy. So, and hope you are and the family are well.
Thanks, Joseph. Organizing kind of principle 101, right? Joseph is mentioning is just like the, you know, the idea that the people closest to the problem have the solutions. The people who are most impacted, right, know how to talk about them and know how to talk about them with others who are, you know, impacted. So just really love that. Thank you, Joseph. And it seems like a very similar thought here too from Berkeley, right? Hopefully I'm saying their name right. By including communities and creating narratives, we're actually able to get much more diverse set of experiences and points of views, right? Second question, anybody want to comment on this last question? What community-based narratives are strategic to advance, or things that you see? Maybe one time for one more comment. Interdependence and shared prosperity, absolutely. And especially in this COVID time, right? It's become so clear that we are interconnected and our health depends on one another. Our livelihood actually depends on one another. Awesome. Any other final thoughts or comments, reflections that people want to share about either the important narratives that you see or the resonating?
I was just going to jump in. I'm Jessica Callejo with the San Francisco Foundation. And when I heard you again sort of remind us about what happened with Prop 15, it really struck a very powerful chord for me, because when you think about $124 million being raised by the opposition and 2-to-1 being outspent 2-to-1, there is just no way that in the way that we have how wealth exists in our communities that we're going to be able to compete with the paid narratives. And it's philosophic and it's also strategic. that we have to do community-driven narratives. There is no way we will be able to have the kind of structural and systems reform that we're seeking. So it was great to hear you put it into such strong, clear words.
Thank you, Tessa. It's totally true. I think we have one. Did I see Vivian's hand up? Digital hand? Go for it, Vivian.
Yeah, thanks, Jung-hee. It just strikes me that there's so much in this bucket. And I want to really appreciate that you started us off with some clear definitions, because I do think that people confuse like narrative is not about polling.
Right.
It's just, there are just many different layers, and just like any other bucket of work, there's kind of there's the surface layer, right? How do we operate right now, given what's on the chessboard? There's the deeper layer of stuff, which is how do we actually change how people are seeing the chessboard? My own crazy little analogy. And it's the more transformative work that actually happens in between election cycles, right? That shift, like that deeper level of work. And then there's the actual infrastructure, which in my crazy head, I'm like, oh yeah, like how big is the megaphone? Like, can we build the actual structures for the megaphone? So like it just helped me to hear you kind of lay it all out. And I think that sometimes in these conversations, we mix it all up, right?
Sure.
So,
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Vivian. That it's exactly right. And so, like we said, I think this is an evolving field, and there's a lot for us to learn from each other and like develop together. So I think we're at time, right, Amato? Do I need to kick it back to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jung-hee, and appreciate the real grappling with the content. Please come off mute, show some digital and love for both Jung-hee and Sandra Witt for getting us started, please. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to turn it to my colleague, Victor Suarez, the Strategic Communications Director at California Calls. Brilliant mind in this narrative and strategist space, who's going to walk us through some of the top line lessons from MVP's public ed campaign. So Victor, let me know if you want to cue this right up, or if you want to start off with some opening comments.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's cue up the slides. Hey everybody, Victor Suarez, super excited to be with all of you and with so many people that are ready to just chat narrative. It's a good room to be in when that happens. So I'm going to be chatting about a public education campaign that MVP launched in 2020. I'm going to be unpacking some of the results, lessons, and impact. But I really kind of just wanted to start by setting some context for both our narrative work in the past year in general. So 2020, without a doubt, was a landmark year in so many ways, but especially for the debate around the role of government, corporate power, race, our criminal legal system, and then the need for revenue in historically underinvested communities. Would be remiss if I also didn't mention, right, that there was a global pandemic, a racial reckoning last summer that only further lifted the need, right, to build narrative power around some of the generational debates about the future of California and the country. And so, like Jung-hee mentioned, in California, power building organizations aligned around generational and structural fight to bring billions of dollars to schools and communities and away from corporations in the form of Proposition 15. And so we knew that narrative power was going to be a key unlock, right, to winning structural change in California, both in and outside the ballot box. We knew that decreasing cynicism, increasing issue support around the role of government, the role of taxes, and building communications infrastructure was going to be key for us. And so with all this in mind, we built a branded campaign that we called RepCA to carry those key messages to millions of California voters. And so there was 4 main key pillars to this campaign: narrative alignment, right, which meant making sure that our partner ecosystem was speaking with one voice as a means to maximize our impact. Compelling content, right, that was able to cut through the noise. We were never going to have the dollars to match the opposition, but if we had compelling content, we'd be able to cut through. Rigorous testing, right, through the commissioning of polls, independence tests, and then building the infrastructure in California around communications that went beyond just one electoral cycle. Next slide. And so the first pillar of the strategy was really about, again, expanding the echo chamber through narrative alignment. And so one of the ways in which we did that was through the development of messaging guides that allowed us to meet movement moments and provided the opportunity to reinforce and align narratives with MVP local partners and anchors. There was three primary messaging guides that we developed. Rep Together, which really aimed to make meaning of the pandemic around the values of equity, interdependence, a government of care and inclusion. There was a Care for Us messaging guide that really connected the demands of essential workers at the peak of the pandemic and really highlighted the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on communities of color. And our Black Lives Matter messaging guide that really centered racial justice and equity and narratives about investing in our schools and communities to combat disinvestment. And so we knew that it was critical for us to adopt a centralized messaging and decentralized implementation model. And so these are just a quick taste of some of the content that we were able to develop through the MVP ecosystem. And so you can kind of see here some of that messaging reflected, right? There's a common thread of the themes of interdependence, cross-racial solidarity, and a government that cares for us. So all of these pieces of content were developed by different organizations, but followed some of the main guiding principles that were key for us to amplifying our message. The second tier of our strategy was scaling reach through digital content. And so in a 2020 world, we knew that saturation and retargeting was going to be critical for us to get our message out. There's a brand building principle, right, that says that people need to see your message or brand 3 to 7 times to even register, even more times if people are even going to pay attention, right? And so that is even more true now. And so we knew that we had to move an aggressive content and data strategy if we were to cut through to voters of color in California. And so with that in mind, we produced 89 videos that range from issue persuasion to voter mobilization, rapid response to current events. We produced a total of 337 graphics, right? From illustrations to memes. We incorporated a feedback loop of rigorous testing through, again, the commissioning of polls and independent studies. And then we did deep dive focus groups that really kind of were aimed to get deep into the impact of particular pieces of content on intended audiences. And so we were able to reach a total of 1.61 million people through this content across digital channels, including apps, websites, social media, an average of 37 times. And then we reached 2.16 million people across social media channels, specifically an average of 10 times. And so I'm going to show a quick video just to kind of give a flavor of the content that folks were seeing, of the messages that we were able to reach folks with. Some video buffering.
Apologies, Victor.
Oh, good. So while the video is loading, this specific video really was centered on really redefining for folks what was possible in their communities, right? And really kind of making sure that we were lifting the frames of investment in communities, right? And really kind of painting a picture, not just against what we were against, but what we were for, and really kind of painting that picture and narrative for folks.
Victor, I'm sorry, it's still buffering. We'll maybe go back through the rest of the presentation and loop back to this.
Cool, sounds good. Next slide. And so part of our content strategy was also included language outreach and innovations, specifically Spanish and Asian languages. And so we ran a campaign through Univision and their digital properties. And it was one of the top performing campaigns in terms of our Spanish outreach. And so we were able to reach or generate 6.1 million impressions through that campaign. We yielded 4.5 million complete views on videos. and drove over 68,000 clicks to the RepCA website that we developed. Our MVP partners developed print and digital content in 9 different Asian languages. And we really focused on centering culture with trusted messengers, right? Through TV, radio, print, ad buys, and in LA also tapped street vendors to disseminate some of the messages that were part of the RepCA campaign. And lastly, building infrastructure to win hearts and minds. And so the primary way in which we were able to do this was through the establishment of a statewide communications body through MVP that really aimed to increase alignment on narrative framework. And so you can see all the organizations that are part of that working body. There are some of the largest and more powerful community-based orgs in the state and locally. And so what this allowed us to do was to create a rapid response infrastructure that allowed us to formulate and think through messages around GOTV, voting options in the middle of a pandemic, responding to voter suppression efforts that were happening in the rural areas of California. It also allowed us to shift some of our narrative practices that we had as communicators and organizers. Too often as organizers and communicators, we tended to lead with the problem, right? Doom and gloom, which feeds cynicism and doesn't move folks to action. And so we were able to kind of pivot away from some of those bad practices to really lead with our shared values, name, race, and class, name the bad actors, and shift away from leading with the problem and reinforcing any opposition framework. And then lastly, we were able to support partners through large and small scale regrants, as well as a technical assistance program that really focused in on critical skills for communicators this past electoral cycle. And so lessons and challenges. So firstly, and this is similar to what Jung-hee mentioned earlier, but we really are finding that we need to be building the narrative for the long haul here. This is not a one election, a one-year project, right? The disinformation and the narratives that we're up against have been decades and decades in the making. And so we need to think similarly, think about the long term and what are the narratives that we're trying to uplift and change throughout California and the country. We are relearning and reaffirming that aspiration, naming race and class, leading with values, calling out the game are key to building narrative power. As a movement for too long, we've contributed to some of that cynicism, like I mentioned earlier, by leading with the problem, sidestepping the question or the conversation around race, or feeling like we have to make a choice between race and class instead of talking about both. And sometimes we focus too much just like on 5-point plans, on 5-point policies, instead of messaging with our 5 senses, right? And really kind of naming what folks are feeling and seeing in their own communities. This past year also underscored the importance of alignment and coordination, right? The shared narrative and decentralized application model was key for us to be able to amplify our outreach. Although we were spent 2-to-1 in the final weeks of the campaign, we came very, very close, and that speaks right to the alignment that happened within our movement, right? And the narratives that we were able to move. In terms of challenges, noise and disinformation are going to be a challenge in the foreseeable future. At California Calls, we recently finalized our vaccination program in our communities, and we were hearing from a lot of folks that we were talking to at the doors and on the phones, a lot of the same misinformation that we see in Facebook memes, right, and Facebook groups. And so a lot of this information is being repeated back to us in the field. And so we need to be contending, right, with that disinformation that's happening. Second challenge is the scale of resources, right? What we have is power building organizations versus what we're up against. Another number that I want to throw out there is that $763 million were spent on ballot initiatives alone in California in 2020, right? That is a ton of money. And a lot of that is coming from the opposition as it relates to their air game, as it relates to the narratives that they're pushing out. And then lastly, we need a larger scale of resources to fund the long-term communications infrastructure and work that we're doing as power building organizations, specifically funding digital content, cultural strategies, the distribution of the content through platforms and ads, vendors to support strategists, trainings, right? All of this is needed to help expand the power building that we're doing. And there's no silver bullet, right? We need to be funding all the aspects of communications work to be able to continue building power towards the long term. In terms of just comparisons, oftentimes when we think about funding communications work. We fund consultants, right? And so really kind of getting away from some of those practices, right? Or challenging some of those assumptions to be able to invest those dollars and building the next bench of communicators, right, in the state, and really kind of focusing in on how we better fund power building organizations as it relates to their communications infrastructure. So I think that is my time. Amalo, did we want to show the video or should I punt over to Sabrina?
Let's get it over to Sabrina, and then we'll see if we can get it on deck after Sabrina.
Okay, so the final thing, hi everybody, my name is Sabrina Smith. I am the Deputy Director of California Calls, and we wanted to just close out with some lessons from the Prop 15 campaign and some summary points in terms of what we think we're learning about structural change. And so as Jung-hee said, Prop 15, this epic battle to close the corporate property loophole, reverse disinvestment in low-income communities of color. This had been the North Star for MVP for many years. We waged the fight in 2020. Everybody thought we were going to be crushed. And while we lost, we came so close. With the results, you can see 48% yes, 52% no, just a 670,000 gap out of a total of 17.1 million votes cast on Prop 15. California last fall saw record registration at over 22 million registered voters now. This is larger than the entire population of Florida in terms of how many registered Californians there are. We saw record turnout at 80.9%. This represented 3 million more ballots cast than in 2016. And Prop 15, in fact, had more ballots cast for a measure and came closest in the face of the well-funded opposition that Victor talked about. There are a number of factors that led to kind of this narrow defeat and could have made the difference. Go ahead, Amado. You know, we've mentioned already that we were outspent 2-1 in the final 2 weeks of the campaign. Our movement really was stretched too thin when you think about the consequential ballot battles of 2020, the multiple ballot measures, the presidential and national races. And COVID really handicapped our grounding. We mobilized 24,000 volunteers, largely on the phones. We engaged folks digitally, but we weren't on the doors, talking to folks and inspiring and motivating them to turn out because of the pandemic. In a post-election poll that we did, there were really 2 factors that were indicators of how people would vote on Proposition 15. The first is how people identified in terms of political party. And so 76% of voters that identified as Democrats voted yes. Only 13% of Republicans voted yes, folks who identified as with the Republican Party. We were slightly underwater with independents. The second indicator was homeowner or renter status and ideology. So just looking at the Democrats that voted yes on 15, 67% of homeowners voted yes compared to 85% of renters. You can see within homeowners, we only gained 60% of moderate and liberals and 79% of progressives compared to 95% of progressive renters and 78% of all other Democratic renters. So when we think about just that 2% margin that we needed to close, we both needed to expand the support of homeowners, but then also expand turnout amongst the rising majority, amongst renters, amongst our base communities, amongst low-income voters across the state. In terms of reasons for the vote, 6 in 10 voters mentioned school funding. We actually pivoted our messaging in the midst of the campaign during the pandemic to really lift the importance of essential workers, the importance of local government services. At the end of the day, that did resonate, but it didn't stick. And so 63% of voters spoke to the need for funding for schools. This speaks to both the decades-long campaigns that have been about funding schools and the work that we need to do to really make the case about the need for local government services. In looking at why voters voted no, Predictably, more conservative voters were concerned about touching Prop 13. They said that the state didn't need the funds. What we've been really trying to unpack, and we're currently doing some research around, is the cynicism about the funding actually reaching schools and reaching communities, and also the fears that raising taxes or closing corporate loopholes will lead to increased cost of living, and the impact on small businesses, which was top of mind, of course, during the pandemic. So in summary, go ahead. Oh, there's one more slide. So just to wrap up some of the lessons, and you've heard these peppered throughout the incredible presentations earlier, but just to bring us home, in terms of winning structural change, what we think we're learning, there are no quick fixes. There are no magic bullets. Structural change is a long-term project, and it requires serious analysis and multi-year efforts to build the power needed and to build the alignment amongst the movement. We thought the coalition would be demoralized by the loss. The good news is that people are excited, they're motivated, they're proud of what we built. And there's an appetite to continue to explore how we take on Prop 13 reform. And now we just have a 2% gap to close. It's critical that we move beyond issue silos and exercise power at a greater scale. And so this really speaks to the multidimensional power that we've been talking about. We have to organize people. We have to build strong, powerful organizations to shape the agenda. And we have to build narrative power, the 3 faces of power that we like to describe. And we have to build power both in the coastal regions where we had our support, as well as the shifting regions where we lost Prop 15. So we have to build infrastructure and multidimensional power as an alliance, as well as in communities throughout the state. Those that are most impacted have to be the forefront of changes. We've talked about this, the most effective messengers, encountering disinformation and spreading the word and building trust. And we also learned that nothing can replace face-to-face. And yet we also need narrative power and strategic communications as well to both follow up, amplify, engage, and shift the narrative.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. So a round of applause for Sabrina and Victor, please. Right now, we know that we ran through a lot of content, both around MVP's public ed campaign, but also some of the narrative lessons from the Prop 15 campaign. So we want to invite any questions, any reactions before we close out the session today. So right now, please get in the chat, come off mute, and pose any questions, comments that are coming up for you right now.
Hi, everyone. Rob Abrush here from CZI. Thank you so much for your presentations. I was just going to note that like some of these like case studies or case building work of like kind of showing a peek behind the curtain of what does it take to actually do this work at scale and what are the components and building blocks is a really, really helpful kind of mirror to put up to not just funders, but to the field to show like what is needed to actually do this work and do it well. So like just it makes me just, it's a reminder to me that more of that is to the extent that we can do that, you know, at faster turnarounds as well. Cause we, you know, there are certain like, you know, people often refer to like the marriage movement as like the case study that folks think about when you're like shifting hearts and minds. But to the extent that we can like localize it or like really kind of bring it into this current environment where we've got like misinformation, where we've got like an even more stacked opposition and a landscape that's just like totally different than 10 years ago, I think is just super, super helpful. And I'm excited to kind of continue to be in thought partnership with you all and with folks on this call.
Thank you, Rob. Emily is in the chat. Junkie, I'm going to point to you on this one. Emily's question is, I'm curious to hear more about the strategies for centralized messaging, decentralized implementation between election cycles, and how we account for the barrier that was just raised about being diffused across several simultaneous measures. And I'm also getting pinged about showing the video. We got our IT together, and we will show that after this question. It is gorgeous. I'm so sorry for the snafus. Junkie, do you want to take this on?
Sure, I can definitely talk about sort of centralized messaging or narrative strategy and decentralized, sort of what we call decentralized, amplification or distribution. So, I think, part of what we've been thinking about is like, how do we actually have, like, if the idea is that we are aligned in the central idea of what we're fighting for, right? So, that corporations should pay their fair share, right? That we need tax equity, that, our communities deserve, or that we need to have a government that cares for us, right? How we talk about that, right, can vary in different communities and with different audiences. And that's part of strategy, is to figure out how do we do that, right? And how do we carry, right? What are the right messages? What are the right, things, ways to carry that message, to carry that narrative. And so what we did really in MVP as well as Empower California is through this building of this infrastructure of a statewide communications body that Victor talked about, we really aligned on the narrative strategy, right? We really aligned on what's the central idea, what's the central narrative that we're trying to communicate. And then we created also shared messaging guides, right? That we said, here are ways that we can talk about and we can communicate our narrative. And then there was a lot of opportunity, and what we wanted to do was actually make sure that we supported our partners in being able to create the content that was going to speak most effectively to their communities, to their audiences, that were going to carry that narrative. And so for some folks, it was a lot of ethnic media and ethnic media ad buys, and they were very creative, right? There was others that were really about content that they were creating digitally that was within language, right? Or for young people when we talk about what's at stake. And so I think what we found was that we saw the most set of content creativity created in the last election, because we actually were able to align on the central narrative, but also give a lot of space and flexibility for for organizations and strategists and leaders to get really creative about how they amplified and create and carry that narrative with their specific audiences or their specific communities. I don't know if Victor or if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I love Vivian's analogy in the chat, but I think part of it was also about making sure that organizations had ownership, right? And allowing for that flexibility and that creativity to happen at the local level. And here's the framework, run with it, make it your own. You all know the best, like what's going to resonate in terms of aesthetic, in terms of what resonates online, in terms of what specific implementation works. So just kind of giving that flexibility to organizations was also another critical component.
One of the manifestations of this work is a video that hopefully will work right now. And then we'll have maybe about 10 more minutes to take any additional questions, reactions.
Ever imagine what our neighborhoods might look like if we had all the resources we need? While our neighborhoods are at their limits, just blocks away, huge corporations amass unimaginable wealth. So what would happen if we came together to make big corporations pay their fair share? Can you see it? Isn't it beautiful?
Any other questions for the team? You know, I think what we're grappling with is really trying to kind of bring you into our strategy, share some lessons, and also grapple with what is going to take to increase investments from philanthropy into community-based narrative. So we want to take some clarifying questions, and we also want to start to grapple what y'all need internally, right? Alignment. I love the working definitions just to establish some baseline, some clarifying questions, other things that kind of come to mind before we close out today.
Rob has a question about the narrative alignment journey, and it was definitely a journey for MVP, because I think back in 2018 is when we really began to develop collectively our understanding of the race class narrative, began to think about how that narrative would come to life in our organizing, in our work. We began field testing it in scripts, at the doors, on the phones. We actually started with a different brand, which some of you may remember, called Power of We. And after several months of testing, the feedback from the field was that it wasn't resonating, right? It didn't feel authentic. It didn't make sense. And so we actually pivoted as we moved into 2020 with a new frame that felt more authentic, that felt about expressing our power, representing California, which was the Rep California brand. So just wanted to offer that it was a long journey of both, alignment. One of the tensions also we have to manage is just the institutional brands and narratives and the campaign framing with a shared frame. And so the work that it takes to really adopt that statewide message and narrative with the flexibility to adopt it centrally is so key, so that folks can continue to organize in an authentic way to their organizations and campaigns with a shared narrative. But both alignment, the field testing, and then the organizers and the canvassers and the folks in the field really keeping us real about what's going to resonate and inspire folks in real life.
A beautiful and dynamic journey indeed. Victor, can I ask you to take on Judith's question about some of the MVP comms infrastructure that we have kind of put into place?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to this. So in terms of the narrative alignment that is still ongoing, we've continued to align folks, right, through our Million Voters Project Communications Committee. So we're meeting weekly right now in the context of the special election, right, to make sure that we're still aligned on narratives, that we're talking through some of the difficulties of messaging, to hear back like a feedback loop in terms of what's coming up for folks. So that piece of the infrastructure is still in place. There's also the more nuts and bolts part of it. There's like platforms, right, that need to be in place, CRMs, making sure that we have a digital presence, right? And so we've still kind of kept that humming along as part of the infrastructure. And then there's a general staffing, right? And so at California Calls, we've begun to kind of expand our communications shop, right, to be able to kind of sustain the level of investment and the level of production, right, that we need to be meeting in order to continue to build narrative power for the long run. So I think of this in terms of two sides, right? There's like the narrative alignment piece that needs to be happening and continue to happen, right, through MVP partners. And there's like the actual individual organizations, right, that need to be staffing up, that need to be having the actual platforms and the in-house capacity to produce content, right, to kind of contend these narratives. And so both of those are humming along, both with organizations and on the MVP front.
Okay, any final questions before I turn it over to Judith to close us out?
I just see Liz's question here in the chat. What is the gap and unmet need in resourcing this work sustainably and robustly? And I would just offer a couple thoughts on that. So one for me is having been doing strategic communications and narrative work for, for the last 20 years in many different organizations, and starting when there was no such thing as strategic communications, right? Joseph can attest to when we were back at COCO together, I started Coalition's communications department, right? And I will just say, like, I think, while it's gotten better, right? We're still lucky if we find a half-time person, if we find a full-time person, right? Doing communications, strategic communications or narrative work in our organizations. And so for me, it's definitely about how do we make sure that we're building the capacity on the ground within on-the-ground organizations to do this work. And it's also about how do we make sure that we are also investing in the movement ecosystem and infrastructure that allows people and communities to align their strategies from the local to the regional to the state, right? And so that we're not just having, we're able to take local narratives, right, that amplify, not just amplify, but that give rise to really, the state and state narratives that need to be told, and vice versa. And we can't, oftentimes what we're hearing is like, we fund organizations, local organizations, without understanding like how they're connected to the regional coalitions, to the MVPs, right, to Power California. And so just being able to understand that this ecosystem, there's a lot of work that's done to align on strategy and being able to invest in that ecosystem and that whole entire infrastructure, and to be able to really develop the community leadership on the ground to be able to do this.
Thanks, Jung-hee.
Mado, a quick question, if possible, for Jung-hee and other folks in the organizations. One of the things that comes up in philanthropy a lot is, foundations are often looking for measurable outcomes. How would you recommend that we look at measuring communications and narrative? It seems much more amorphous. I mean, obviously in organizing, you got, whether there's a campaign or there's kind of output metrics that you can track along the way. What are ways to measure in communications and narrative work?
I'm going to call on Victor and Sabrina, who were thankfully grappling with this very question for this session. Joseph, Victor?
Yeah, happy to jump in here. And Sabrina, I'll tap you if you have any additions. But I think there's two ways in which we think about this. I think one of the big ways is building feedback loops for programs, right? And this can take a couple of different shapes. There's some of the polling, right, that we can do to see if content or narratives are actually moving the audiences that we're intending to move. And so, having funding, right, to commission some of these polls and focus groups is critical. I think content tests are another sort of big thing, right? A/B testing different sort of narratives, products that we're intending to move. And there's those tend to be a little bit more affordable, right? And easier to kind of deploy on the ground. And so we want to get a quick sense of what's working or what's not working. I think it's a great measurement to just kind of A/B test something through digital channels. And then what Sabrina and Jung-hee mentioned, right? Making sure that we're building feedback loops within our own organizations, right? So that the folks on the ground that are communicating and disseminating these narratives, right? Organizers, canvassers, phone bankers, making sure that there's space for them to communicate with us, hey, this is working, this is not working. And that tends to be a little bit more intangible, but I think super crucial, right? To just kind of hear from folks. And so there's like that anecdotal feedback on top of the, more formal testing that is typically done with campaigns like polling and A/B testing. The other sort of piece that we've been looking at has been about hearing messages repeated back, right? So I think as we look at, doing media scans, right, around headlines, around framing, like what frames are they using? Are the frames that we're putting out the ones getting picked up, or is it the oppositions? Are there other dominant frames being picked up in terms of media, in terms of headlines? And I think it's true for voters as well, right? As we're talking to voters repeatedly throughout the year, what are they saying back to us, right? Are they using the opposition's framework? Are they using a different dominant framework? Or have we been able to break through, right, in terms of the narratives and stories that we're telling. Sabrina, I don't know if you have anything to add on that front.
No, it was great. Jung-hee, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are some good indicators, and we use them too. We, definitely look at message pull through, like whether it's in the media or, elected officials, right? I think the other thing I might put here, Joseph, is I might actually challenge the idea that we could, of this idea that they are like, oh, we can tell because that we've changed the dominant narrative, right? It's like, I think one thing that we have to, and I think Sabrina, you said this earlier, it's like no magic bullet, right? And this is a long-term project because what we're basically contending for is power, right? And power doesn't change overnight. And we can't say, oh, now we've done it. And at the same time, we have measurements for it if we're shifting power, right? How many people did we move to the polls who supported our issue? How many candidates in, political races, this is for people who do C4 electioneering work, right? Did we get elected? How many, those are, if we can see narrative as integrated into, right, our power building strategies, those are also measurements for how we can say, like, our narratives are working because we're winning, right? And those in that way, I don't think they're supremely different, right? And ultimately, it's whether we are able to achieve those goals.
Thank you, Jung-hee. We have a question in the chat from Ruby too about measurements and a discussion about the messenger and how that matters. I felt like this was one of the real inflection points around the Prop 15 campaign and some of the hijacking of social justice messengers, social justice messaging, targeting particularly Black and Brown communities. I'm curious if there's any other specific responses we have for Ruby's question.
I would say that as always, messengers matter, right? And it really depends upon who's our audience and what's the strategy, like what's our goal, right? And who do we need to move? And so I think, in any of these conversations, like the messenger matters. And I think it's also, especially in this age of hyper disinformation, right? And that being able to get information from people that you trust, right? Not just individuals, but organizations and community institutions and, local civic leaders really matters. And it's also why we have to make sure, just coming back to my principal point, is that we have to make sure that we are investing in developing, right, the community-driven narrative strategists, right, who are coming from our communities, and we're building that leadership, right, because they're ultimately the best messengers.
Awesome. I know we're getting at time, so if there aren't any burning questions, I'm actually going to turn it over to Judith Bell, who will help close us out.
Thanks, Amato. Great to see everybody here today and to be a part of the conversation. I just want to reflect a little bit and talk about the path forward. And since we're funders, also talk about the opportunities for funding, because there are many. Just to start, just huge kudos for the thoughtful presentation. And I would just say that, as someone who's been around the block a few times, used to be you'd sit around and you'd think, what we need is. And so today we're actually able to say is what we have. And it's quite exciting to hear about the collective infrastructure, to hear about the feedback loops, to understand how much it's embedded in organizations at the local level, embedded in organizations at state level, and how alignment is being built. Just tremendously inspiring and so important for moving the agendas that we care about. So how do we think about the path forward? Where are these opportunities for supporting? Starting with research and narrative development. You've heard already today how much the accomplishments, how much the path to this point has had research, has had data. There is some very exciting research that's underway to examine emotional drivers, to take a look at the connection to values, to look at deeply held beliefs, and to understand how they shape voter attitudes on key issues and what that can tell us in the context of moving these structural change agendas. What's underneath, for instance, the cynicism towards local government, and how can we counter that? How do we build support for structural solutions? How do we think about the messages that can reframe the conversation so that we can focus on investment, the investment that's needed to improve the lived experience of key communities? These are all things that are underway that need support. MVP and its partners need support to produce updated messaging guides, to develop further the field of communications collaborative, things like narrative training, scripts, digital assets. These are all the things that are needed to continue this deep research and deep narrative development. What else is needed? We've been talking over and over today about how much this is a long-term agenda, right? We're on a long-term journey here. We're fighting for long-term power. And so what do we need there? We need to make sure that we're providing the resources really to figure out what the best opportunities are for structural reform. So MVP has convened what it's been calling its North Star Committee, and it's looking at advancing structural reforms that are widening the wealth gap, the widening economic inequality, really widening inequities, and thinking about the steps we can take that can dismantle systemic injustice, systemic racism, and really advance racial equity. And so in this committee, which includes groups from across the state, groups from regions, it's really been, I've been privileged to be a part of this, and it's been incredibly exciting to see the engagement of leaders from around the state, and then to see them assessing what are now 7 reforms that are being systematically assessed. So what about increasing revenue? What about issues around housing, around climate, around criminal justice, around residency and rights for immigrants, around universal family care, and around overturning the 2/3 supermajority? So the effort now is to decrease that down to 3, to figure out how and which ones to focus efforts on, which ones have the highest likelihood to win, which can achieve the kind of structural changes that will really matter in the communities that we care about. How do we identify those strategic opportunities that really will also draw together the kind of broad united fronts that we know we need for change? So there's funding opportunities here for developing campaign, for coalition staffing, and for public education campaigns. And then finally, right, what we've been talking about today, underscoring underneath what we're really talking about is consolidating and expanding power. That's really the driving force, the root to what we're doing. And on that front, there are opportunities both on the C3 and the C4 side. There's a September 14th special election program, and then there are stepping stone battles from 22 to the statewide, which will also obviously be national battles in 24. And so there's a need here around the special election. Again, for MVP, they're deploying a large-scale program. It's designed to educate voters, it's designed to engage voters, and it's about the upcoming election. And then the Action Fund is deploying a program to defeat the recall on the C4 side. And again, these stepping stone battles for 22 are really designed to give us the kind of information we need from regional, from local battles that really will then allow us to deploy and to be even more effective for statewide battles in 24. I know there's a final poll that we want to do before we close out. So why don't I turn it over to the poll and then just come back from some very, very final comments.
Thank you so much.
There we go.
So we want to ask.
Your phones.
Yep, there you go.
Go back to your phones, answer this final question. What's your level of interest for future narrative power learning opportunities? And of course, we're hoping that this conversation and what you are working on, but this conversation has really increased your interest, increased your enthusiasm, and hopefully will also increase your desire for future conversations. You know, the pathway from a session like today of discussion to actually moving resources, right? This is just a first step. And so we're hoping for those follow-ups, for those deeper explorations, for the alignment with your institution, so that we can increase the support for this work that is so very important. for advancing the kinds of changes that are needed to make the state more equitable, to allow more people to engage, really to change the power in California, and to change our future narrative in a way that people really are supported in their lives and in their communities. Back to you, Amato, for anything final you'd like to say as we end today. And thanks again, everyone, for being here. And thanks for all the presenters as well.
Thank you so much, Judith. Help me thank all of our co-sponsors, our friends at the California Endowment, friends at the San Francisco Foundation, Northern California Grant Makers. Just deep gratitude. We would be sure to follow up with the link to the recording, specific materials, and if there are any opportunities for further investments in the Million Voters Project and our strategic communications work, please contact myself. I'll make sure to include my email address in the follow-up. Thank you so much, and everybody, hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.